Hello, and welcome to week 10 of the Old Testament. Seems like forever, and it will be forever, a lifetime to get through the whole of the Old Testament. But I have been saying for the past 9 weeks that basically you have to look at the whole book in order to understand it. And that's what we're going to start to do. We're going to take some time and look at the whole book. Last time I started talking about the concept of covenant. And covenant is where it all begins. And it's not trying to use a big word. We've all heard that word before. For Catholics, they've heard it during Mass. Talking ended marriage, they've definitely heard about covenant. And that's not just a Catholic thing. And what is a covenant? Some people look at covenants kind of like a contract when you sign a dotted line. And, that's correct as far as it goes. Others will see a covenant as a legal way to make someone family. Obviously, someone who wasn't part of your family before, and so with a covenant, you can make them a member of your family. Two excellent examples of covenants are adoption and marriage. In the case of adoption, at least in the ancient world, you would make a child unrelated to you before the priests, village elders, or some other official and swear solemn oaths that the child was now yours. And that was usually also shown by giving them their name. They didn't have a name before you gave it to them. And then you went home, and they went home as your son or daughter. And to this day, we typically stand before a priest, minister, a judge to swear oaths to each other in terms of marriage. Two people enter a building as Jonathan Morse and Jane Doe, and leave as, in the old days it used to be a woman changed her name, would be Mr. and Mrs. Jonathan Morse. Well, nowadays, some people do that, some people don't. They keep their maiden names. But two strangers have become family by making a covenant. Marriage is perhaps not as popular a thing as it used to be a generation ago. People put it off longer and longer, if they ever get around to it at all. Relationships are more casual. They hook up for a while, and then they unhook, I suppose. And singles, so many times I've heard this, they have a problem with that C word called commitment. And that's what marriage is all about, commitment. Some of you may know I'm a widower. My wife has deceased. Obviously, that's why I'm a widower. But she was sick for 24 of our 36 years of marriage. Everybody told me I should divorce her. But we made a commitment to each other. I wouldn't have expected her to divorce me because I got sick, so she couldn't expect me to divorce her. And as a matter of fact, the state even asked us to save money and get her onto Medicaid and Medicare on a different rate. But she chose not to, because we were committed to each other. Of course, I used to tell her a joke, and I told it over and over again because she had dementia, so I could tell her the same joke and it wouldn't catch on. And I say, Kathy, you took your wedding vows too seriously. And she looked at me like, yeah. I said, for better or worse, for richer, for poor, and sickness and health. Could you pick any of the good ones? And she'd laugh at that every single time. God believes in marriage and family. The relationship he seeks with all of us, and each one of us personally, is no casual affair, is no on again, off again thing. A covenant relationship he wants with us is he and we become one, similar to marriage. Till death do us part? No. At least the Byzantines in our wedding ceremonies, we cut that line out because we believe marriage is forever. If you come from a Western tradition, it's until death. And what does he desire? says, not godly children. God is all about commitment and love that lasts forever. That the relationship that we form with Him, a covenant relationship we form with Him, goes our whole life through and then into the next life. And it is a covenant of love. And all that is packed into that simple word, covenant. Besides covenant, there's another somewhat technical term we need to talk about, and that's mediator. It often happened in ancient times that folks wanted to make covenants that involved more than two people. For example, perhaps a king wanted to let a group of foreigners into his family, basically become part of his kingdom. He would then make a covenant with them. Usually one person would step forward to represent the group with whom the covenant was made. That person was the mediator. So we can talk about covenant mediators, by which we mean persons who represent groups of people involved in a covenant. In the Bible, there are a number of important covenant mediators. The most significant ones are Adam, Noah, Abraham, Moses, David, and in the Christian scriptures, Jesus. Each one of them entered into a covenant with God, and each one of them represented a group of people who entered into a God's covenant through them. Now, there's a concept of what we call corporate personality. These covenant mediators were probably corporate personalities, where one person can represent the whole. And we kind of, in a democracy, say that doesn't really work. But if you kind of look at the President of the United States, don't take this in individual cases, the President of the United States represents all of us. So when he goes traipsing off to, say, France, and he meets with President Macron, he represents all of us, and the two of them can come to understandings of things. And they can form agreements and then have to go to Congress and everything else. For the Americans, but sometimes in other countries, doesn't have to go through anything other than the president or the king or whoever he's dealing with as a corporate personality. Now, another term that we use in these covenants is the term mountain. Actually, we don't need to define it because everyone knows what a mountain is, except for the folks who I was in Kuwait, and you should have seen the Kuwaiti mountains. They would take me to the Kuwaiti mountains, and they were probably 2 stories high, and that was the big guy that brought everybody out to the Kuwaiti mountains. So they come from mostly flat people. The people who come from some of the United States don't see anything but green fields forever. In the course of the Bible, God makes at least 6 major covenants with the men mentioned above: Adam, Noah, Abraham, Moses, David, and Jesus. For the sake of this course, we're only going to talk about those 5 covenants, not counting Jesus. So if you want to understand the whole of the Old Testament, then you can take those 5 covenants as the understanding of the whole and leave it there. Whereas if you're a Christian, you would then add on the covenant with Jesus. So we will not be doing in this course the covenant with Jesus. And basically they make up the path of salvation history. Now, these covenants, in many cases, are made on a mountain top. So it can't be an accident. There must be something about mountains that makes them suitable for a meeting with God. What might that be? An old and wise priest pointed out to me some years ago that mountains make you feel closer to God. There's a couple reasons for this. First of all, mountain peaks tend to be lonely places. without the usual people and busyness around. It's easier to focus on a basic reality, yourself and God. Second, mountain peaks help a person to get a God's eye view of things. When viewed from a mountaintop, the farm you live on or the city you live in, which may seem enormous when you're down there, but it's now the size of a postage stamp. Now you can see it only one of dozens or maybe even hundreds of farms stretching out in all directions. Things you can see there are part of a much bigger pattern, not visible before. From the mountaintop, you were able to move. You are more or less alone with God. You can see much more. It all looks smaller. You can see everything in context, together with its surroundings. Maybe these are some of the reasons people feel closer to God on the top of a mountain and describe strong religious feelings as mountaintop experiences. By the way, that's not required. Why I say that? Because when I do mountaintop experiences, I'm just filled with fear. I don't like it up there. As a matter of fact, one of my hobbies is painting, and I never paint mountains. But I have my experience with water. I feel very close to God. It's very calm and peaceful, and that's where I think that God talks to me. If you go far enough, and behind me here, you can see some water. Okay, so that's it for the preliminaries, and so we will start looking at the covenants in more detail. And the first place to begin is the covenant with Adam. Now, if you're normal, I'm assuming you are, one of the reasons you pick up a Bible is you want to discover what is the meaning of life. And that's one of the purposes that God inspired the authors of the Bible to teach us the meaning of life. And, I think we've all gone through questions. Our journey to get to wherever we are when we reach my age. I did lots of things before trying to find my purpose of life. And sometimes, some people do it and they're very cynical and everything else. And you can find life without God. You can find life in philosophy. You can find life in science. I don't think they're as good, but if they satisfy you, it's the search for meaning. Why are we here? And that's somewhat tied up with where do we come from? Now, I keep looking at my family tree, and I keep running into barriers and trying to get information about my ancestors. But it's kind of nice to know my family tree. I'm Irish, English, and Italian. That means the Irish and the English are always fighting in me, but the Italian food calms it all down. And but I can't go back beyond my grandfather on my mother's side, my mother's father, because I can't get the records from Italy. I've tried. Even the Mormons in Salt Lake City don't have them. And I think there was kind of a name change somewhere, and that makes it difficult. I've gotten back my father's family to the Civil War. I have an ancestor, a great, who died the day before the Battle of Gettysburg. And he died of an ulcer. He was from New York. And so I haven't gotten much more. So nowadays, with the internet and all, there's several ways of finding out your roots. And then, of course, there's the DNA test. My only caution is, remember, if you get it done, your DNA becomes a record for the police to check at any time. They need, if they want to see if you committed a crime, past, present, or future. And, that's not the reason I don't do it, because my DNA is on file. Anybody who serves in the military service of this country gives them a DNA sample. So somehow knowing where we come from helps us figure out who we are. It also kind of gives us a setting. We talked about understanding the Bible in its cultural milieu. Well, the same thing of we as readers. We have to look at our cultural milieu. I am an American. Yes, I have lived in other countries, and it's interesting because I brought my milieu there, and I didn't, fit in exactly, but we were going to work together, and I came to understand their cultural milieu. They came to understand mine, but still, we are products somewhat of our culture. Maybe that's why the Bible devotes a fair amount of space telling us about our first father, Adam, and his wife, our mother, who was later called Eve. Now, the Bible is pretty specific about the reasons Adam was made and his role in the universe was to be. Moreover, Adam was and is a model for all people. The purpose or meaning of his life remains the purpose and meaning for each of our lives. Now, before we take a look at the purpose of Adam's life, bear with me for a moment while we sketch in some background. After all, Adam wasn't the first thing that God created. Now, the week of creation. Remember I mentioned parallelism? Well, it's very prevalent in this creation story. Now, the 6 days. Is this meant to be taken literally? You get involved in creationism versus Darwinism, all that types of stuff. But we need to put them on the back burner for the moment, because it's not the primary questions the writer of Genesis wanted to answer. Instead, he inspired the author to want to reach us, to teach us something about the purposes for which God made the world in the first place. The Bible begins with a summary of life on earth. Then it begins to get specifics of how God went about it. The next verse says, "The world, the earth, was formless and void, and darkness was over the face of the waters." Genesis 1, verses 2. The picture here is of a world, the universe, that exists. It's not finished yet. It has two problems. It's formless and void. Now, they're not terms to repeat one another. Formless and void. Of course, in Hebrew, the term is tohu wabohu. It kind of rhymes. It's kind of like our higgly-piggly type expression. The more specifically, formless, that is unformed or unshaped. The other, void or empty. So God calls the cosmos into existence, but it has two problems. It is unformed and empty. It needs to be formed and filled. And that's what God sets out to do in the following 6 days. Now, what I want you to do is to write down 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, the parallelism. 1 relates to 4, 2 relates to 5, 3 relates to 6. You can do them either column, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, or 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3. It doesn't make any difference. And 1, 2, 3 will be the first 3 days of creation, where God addresses the problem of formlessness. He's going to form and shape creation, starting with the first day, when he creates light and darkness, which is called the first day. So, the first, with 1, just say that night and day, he's created time. That's how we experience time, night and day. So, put down the word time. The second day, God creates the great expanses of space, the skies and the seas. Now, God has created space. On the third day, God creates the dry land and the vegetation. And so you can call that the habitat. Time, space, habitat. At the end of 3 days, he's taking things and given it shape. He's given it form. So it's no longer formlessness. He solved that one problem. The cosmos is formed, but it remains empty. So the next 3 days, God has to fill things in. And the realm of time, the day of night, is filled with its inhabitants. What gives us day and night? The sun, the moon, the stars. Gives us the seasons. And so you have time being inhabited with the sun, the moon, and the stars. Then God starts filling the great spaces with birds and fish on the 5th day. A few habitat remains now. And on the 6th day, God makes animals and man. Now, so you've got a pillar. But, as you know, there's 7 days. And the 7th day, God made it a day of rest. And the Sabbath. Kind of like the roof over all other creation. It doesn't fit in the first column, doesn't fit in the second column. It fits over them all. It's kind of like God built his own temple on earth. Now, the language of creation resembles the language of Moses, building the tabernacle in the wilderness. So look at Genesis chapter 2, verses 1 through 3, and Exodus 39, 32, and 42 and 43. That's Genesis 2, 1 through 3, Exodus 29, 32, 42, 43. Some scriptures speak of creation as a temple. You'll find that in Psalms 78, verse 69, and Psalm 148. In other words, ancient writings from about the same time as Genesis, it is clear that the people considered the whole universe as kind of a temple for worship of God or gods. It is a common idea in ancient times. So now, we return to asking our questions about the creation of Adam. What was the purpose of his life? Well, the first thing you can say, Adam he was created in the image and likeness of God. In Genesis, it says it. What does that mean? Well, when he had a son, it says that the son was created in the image and likeness of Adam. That was 30 years later. He became the father of Seth. So what does image and likeness mean? The fancy theological term is divine filiation. We're talking about being a child of God. Now, let me say this right up front. This is only one interpretation of image and likeness. Byzantines have a much more evolved theology of image and likeness, which I may fit in sometime later. But for the purposes here and now, I'm keeping it simple. Because image and God doesn't repeat himself. I'm going into a whole other bit. So, the first thing is Adam is made God's son. And so, therefore, if he is God's son, he shares in God's glory. And so, he shares in the glory, and he's given a garden. And he is to till it and keep it. Now, 2 jobs he has to do. This phrase in Hebrew is literally to serve it and to guard it. It's like a police officer almost. To serve and protect. It is uncommon to find these two words together in the Bible. We will not find them together again until much later in Numbers chapter 3, where these two words, serve and guard, together describe what the priests do in the place of worship. So, the ancient readers probably understood this garden to be the original temple, and later temples were understood to look like it. So, therefore, Adam had a priestly role in Eden, the original temple. And so he had other jobs besides his priesthood, which was to serve and to guard. Adam is given dominion over all the creatures on earth. I'll spare you the language studies on dominion and cut to the chase. This is a kingly role. And Adam was king of all living things on earth. Now, the ancient Jews took this for granted. Next, we see in Genesis 2:18-20, God gives Adam the job of naming the animals. This may not seem like a big deal to us, but in ancient times, giving a name was a very important privilege. Only the creator of something could grant a name to it. If you write a song, molded a sculpture, made a painting, produced a child, you had the right to name it, no one else. God, in making Adam his deputy and giving him a divine privilege, the right to name God's creatures, not only that, but as Adam gives the creatures names, he is really speaking on behalf of God. What do we call a person who speaks on behalf of God? We call them a prophet. So now you see Adam is a king, a priest, and a prophet. Now, there's one final role for Adam. The Bible tells us there was no helper fit for him among the animals. So the Lord put him into a deep sleep, and I'll go into that into another story, I will, and made the woman for him out of his rib. The next morning, when Eve was brought to Adam, he burst out in poetry. Remember, I told you these little things like this make things important. Bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh, she shall be called woman, because she was taken out of man. The first poetry found in the Bible, so to speak, not the oldest, because the book was written later. Through it, we see the civilizing effect that Eve has on Adam. Up to this point, he had been sitting around naming animals: dog, ape, porcupine, salamander. Now he sees woman, and he becomes the bard. He's Shakespeare. He doesn't just give a name. He gives it in poetry, and almost like a sonnet. Perhaps the sacred writer wants to point out that the arrival of woman is a high point in God's creation, and the woman brings the best point out of man. And by the way, this idea that since woman completes creation, does say that she is higher. Anything that completes fulfills. So humanity was always lacking until she came along. Now, in addition to being poetry, this elegant little statement, bone of my bone, is covenant-making language. He's declaring her to be his kin, part of his family. And that's what you do in a covenant, make someone your kin. To this day, most weddings, an unrelated man and woman go into church, and then they come out as kinfolk. And so here you have the first bride and groom, the first wedding with God officiating. So so he's not just any bridegroom either. He's the universal bridegroom. He's married to all humanity, all their descendants. He is in relationship with. She's in relationship. And remember, the doctors have found we all share some part of common DNA with one woman, and they call her Eve. It's a whole other. I'm not going to get into that scientific, but we're all genetically related to Adam and Eve. So he's married to all of humanity. This gives us the portrait of Adam that, according to Genesis 1:2, the firstborn son, king, priest, prophet, and bridegroom. And we'll continue to understand how that relates to us next time. I thank you for being with me this week. Hope you are enjoying this. I hope you find it a blessing and helping in your spiritual journey of life. And may God bless you and keep you.